Today we are opening up a highly provocative, deeply polarizing new ebook that is making, honestly, massive waves in the cultural conversation right now.
It really is everywhere.
Yeah, it's inescapable. But before we dive into the architecture of this text, do us a quick favor and hit the like and subscribe buttons right now so you never miss a deep dive. Seriously, just tap those buttons. It helps us keep bringing you these extensive, really deep explorations into the ideas that are shaping our world.
It makes a huge difference.
Exactly. So the text on the table today is called Traditional Values Triumph: Why Men Must Lead Again. And this was written by Conrad Riker, published in 2025.
Right, and to set the baseline for this analysis, it is essential to understand exactly who this book is written for. The text is explicitly engineered for a men's rights activist audience. Specifically, he's targeting that demographic commonly referred to as red-pilled or, manosphere men. The rhetoric throughout these chapters is intense, and the sociological claims the author makes are very sweeping.
Which, that actually brings up a crucial point about our mission today for you, the listener. We are taking a purely analytical, strictly impartial look at this manifesto. I want to be really clear here. We are not here to endorse Riker's viewpoints.
No, not at all.
Nor are we here to condemn them. Our mission is to just dissect the core arguments, examine the specific data, the historical examples cited by the author, and meticulously map out the worldview presented in the text. The whole goal is to help you understand the precise mechanics and, really, the appeal of this cultural movement.
Completely independent of how you might personally feel about the subject matter.
Right.
It is essentially an exercise in ideological cartography. By looking at exactly how the author constructs his arguments, the historical through lines he draws, the specific evidence he relies upon, we just gain a much clearer picture of why this messaging is currently resonating with millions of men.
Yeah, millions. So if this deep dive hooks you and you want to examine the primary source for yourself to see how Riker constructs these arguments firsthand, you can find Traditional Values Triumph on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. You can also follow the author on his Substack. His handle is @ConradRiker. So let's get straight into the text. Riker he doesn't waste time easing the reader in.
Not even a little bit.
Chapter 1 begins with a foundational premise that acts as the load-bearing wall for the rest of the book. He asserts that the entire concept of gender equality is a myth.
And the framing of that word myth is highly specific in Riker's context. According to the text, he isn't framing this as a philosophical disagreement or a debate over social policy. He frames it as a biological absolute.
Right, hard science in his view.
Exactly. The author argues that modern society has spent decades trying to replace hard evolutionary reality with flimsy social constructs. And he views this as a catastrophic civilization-level mistake. He asserts that fundamental millions of years old evolutionary differences make true, across-the-board equality a literal impossibility.
So how does he actually define those biological imperatives within the text? Because he relies heavily on the idea that men and women are essentially built for entirely different societal functions, right?
Precisely. The book claims that men are, on a statistical average, physically stronger and neurologically geared toward risk-taking, competition, and systemic problem-solving.
Oh.
And according to Riker, this naturally and inescapably wires men for leadership and provision.
And then for women.
Conversely, the text argues that women are biologically and hormonally wired for childbearing, nurturing, and maintaining the micro-community of the family unit. He insists throughout the first chapter that these are not cultural stereotypes imposed by patriarchy.
Right.
He says they are inescapable evolutionary truths that originally developed to maintain social order and ensure human survival.
Okay, but if he believes these traits are so deeply hardwired into our DNA, how does he explain the current cultural climate? I mean, a climate where those exact traits are frequently challenged or even viewed negatively.
That is where his critique of modern ideology comes into play. The author explicitly points the finger at feminism and what he terms cultural Marxism.
Cultural Marxism, right.
Yeah, the text argues that these modern movements have intentionally twisted biological realities into a narrative designed to demonize innate masculinity. Riker claims that by trying to force men and women to be entirely interchangeable in the workplace, the home, the military society is essentially fighting a losing war against nature itself.
Which leads directly into his deconstruction of the phrase toxic masculinity. This is a huge central theme of his early chapters. Riker absolutely goes after the mainstream use of this phrase. He labels it a misandrist double bind. For the listener who is trying to map out his rhetorical strategy here, How exactly is Riker defining that double bind mechanically?
He frames it as a psychological trap that modern culture sets for men. A double bind, by definition, is a situation where a person is confronted with two irreconcilable demands, making success impossible.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. Riker posits that society still implicitly demands men to man up, to be strong, stoic providers, to be assertive in their careers, and to protect their families.
Right.
However, the book argues the absolute moment a man exhibits those exact necessary traits, the assertion, the physical strength, the competitiveness, he is instantly shamed by modern institutions and labeled as aggressive, overbearing, or toxic.
So it is presented as a rigged game. The traditional expectations of manhood are still quietly enforced by society, but the behaviors actually required to meet those expectations are publicly criminalized.
That's his core argument there, yes.
And to back up this claim of a societal disconnect, Riker pulls in some specific polling data. He cites a 2021 YouGov poll finding that 70% of men believe society benefits from strong male leadership.
Yes.
I mean, 70% is a massive supermajority number. How does the book utilize that specific data point?
It serves as the empirical bedrock for his silent majority argument. By highlighting that 70% figure, the book asserts that despite the overwhelming dominance of progressive messaging in media and academia, the vast majority of men intuitively understand the need for traditional male leadership.
They just aren't saying it out loud.
Exactly. Riker uses this YouGov data to essentially tell the reader, your instincts are not a fringe ideology. You are the majority, but you have been culturally conditioned and shamed into apologizing for your natural inclinations.
And to illustrate the real-world friction of this disconnect, the author leans on a few highly specific anecdotes. One that takes up a significant portion of this first section is the story of a woman who sued her ex-husband for alimony. The book describes her as someone who publicly built her entire identity around being a strong, fiercely independent feminist.
Right.
Yet during the divorce proceedings, she ruthlessly demanded long-term financial provision from her ex-husband.
And the author weaponizes that specific anecdote to highlight what he views as the fundamental hypocrisies structurally embedded within the modern feminist movement. Through Riker's lens, feminism attempts to secure all the benefits and privileges of traditional gender roles, specifically the safety net of male financial provision.
While rejecting the rest of it.
Exactly, without accepting any of the corresponding traditional responsibilities like deference or domestic contribution. He frames this dynamic as a desire to have it both ways, which he claims intellectually bankrupts the entire movement.
He also moves from that individual anecdote to a macro, structural example, pointing to Sweden. The book claims that the implementation of gender-neutral bathrooms in Sweden directly correlated with increased incidents of sexual harassment. How does he connect a purely architectural change to his broader claim about biological determinism?
He uses the Swedish bathroom initiative as a microcosm for the danger of ignoring biology. The text argues that when policymakers pretend physical differences and vulnerabilities between the sexes do not exist, they create environments where predatory behavior thrives.
I see.
Riker utilizes this to argue that progressive attempts to socially engineer a gender-blind society do not result in utopian equality. Instead, they result in tangible, measurable harm to the very people those policies claim to protect.
The architecture of his argument here is setting up a really stark dichotomy.
Yeah.
On one side, you have the progressive attempt to erase gender differences, which he argues leads to chaos and danger. And on the other side, you have his proposed solution, a rigid embrace of unchangeable biological truths, which naturally paves the way for his deep dive into Section 2. This focuses on what he calls the crisis of masculinity and the modern push for male vulnerability.
And this is where the text launches a remarkably harsh critique of modern therapeutic culture. The prevailing cultural narrative today strongly encourages men to open up, to be emotionally vulnerable, and to freely share their insecurities. Riker categorically rejects this framework.
Completely throws it out.
The text explicitly states vulnerability is weakness, and weakness is not what the world needs from men.
It is a complete inversion of modern psychological advice. And to ground this controversial stance, the book shares an extended anecdote about a man he refers to as Tom. According to the text, Tom was a man feeling entirely adrift, struggling with his career, facing immense pressure from his partner and society to open up and be emotionally vulnerable to solve his problems.
But the narrative of Tom takes a sharp pivot. Instead of succumbing to therapeutic intervention, the book states that Tom completely rejected the pressure to open up. He stopped talking about his feelings and instead focused on taking rigorous physical and professional action.
Right.
He started lifting weights heavily, focused obsessively on building inner stoicism, set rigid, uncompromising career goals, and fundamentally stopped apologizing for his masculine instincts.
And the result of that pivot, according to Riker, was that Tom achieved significantly greater financial success, actually found deeper and more respectful relationships, and discovered a sense of profound purpose that endless emotional vulnerability never provided him. Tom isn't just presented as a guy in the story.
No, he's presented as a replicable blueprint for the reader. The book uses Tom to assert that traditional masculine traits, stoicism, physical strength, courage, and decisiveness, are not toxic artifacts of a bygone era. They are, in fact, hardwired, incredibly necessary tools for navigating a chaotic world.
Because of evolution.
Exactly. The author argues that these traits evolved over millennia because they were the exact mechanisms required for human survival, resource acquisition, and societal stability.
And to find the historical gold standard for this type of unabashed masculinity, the text points directly to Theodore Roosevelt. Riker spends considerable time praising Roosevelt for wholly embracing traditional masculine traits. He highlights his philosophy of facing challenges head-on, engaging in intense physical exertion, and just refusing to over-intellectualize adversity.
Yes, the book presents Roosevelt as the ultimate historical proof that aggressive, unapologetic masculinity is the engine that drives dynamic, world-shaping leadership.
But he doesn't just rely on history. To support that historical romanticism with modern empirical data, the author cites a specific study from the Journal of Social Psychology. The book notes that this study analyzed group dynamics in crisis situations.
And according to the text, the research found that groups led by men who exhibited traditional authoritative leadership qualities consistently performed better. They made faster decisions and achieved higher survival metrics than groups led by consensus or by individuals exhibiting more passive, vulnerable traits.
By focusing on crisis situations, Riker is essentially arguing that when the artificial comforts of modern society are stripped away, the biological instinct for authoritative male leadership is the only thing that actually ensures collective survival. And he scales that micro-level group dynamic up to entire civilizations. He cites research from the University of Cambridge, claiming that societies structured around strong male leadership are 50% more stable.
He leans very heavily on that Cambridge data. He uses it to argue that the modern impulse to socialize the masculinity out of young boys is not just misguided, but actively suicidal for a civilization. Riker argues for what he terms a masculine renaissance.
The masculine renaissance.
Right, a cultural movement that stops pathologizing male energy and instead harnesses it, channeling it back into productive, unapologetic leadership roles.
Which brings up a glaring structural question within the book's logic. If traditional masculinity is so vital to societal stability and individual happiness, why has the culture moved so aggressively away from it? Riker answers this in Section 3 by turning his focus squarely onto feminism and its long-term impact on modern relationships.
Yes.
The text argues that feminism made a very specific, alluring promise to society, the promise of total liberation.
But the core thesis of this chapter is that feminism completely failed to deliver on that promise. Riker asserts that instead of true liberation, the dismantling of traditional gender roles delivered widespread dependency, immense psychological stress, and severe societal fragmentation. He specifically targets the modern dating landscape as ground zero for this failure.
Right, looking closely at hookup culture and the gamification of romance through dating apps. Looking through Riker's lens, the erosion of traditional courtship values in the digital dating sphere has left both men and women entirely adrift. The book claims that women are currently being crushed under the weight of an impossible contradictory standard.
They are expected to fiercely compete in full-time corporate careers, successfully raise well-adjusted children, and maintain a household, all while being culturally mandated to feel empowered and liberated by this exhausting workload.
While simultaneously, the text argues, men are told to suppress their natural biological instincts to pursue, provide, and protect. Riker claims this creates a chaotic dynamic where neither sex understands their societal script anymore. Because the traditional roles have been burned down, expectations are entirely mismatched.
Leading to a profound society-wide sense of romantic isolation and resentment. And to provide empirical backing for this claim, he looks back at Sweden, a country he points out is globally hailed as the ultimate progressive feminist utopia.
Right, the logic being if progressive policies create happiness, Sweden should be the happiest place on earth.
Yeah.
But Riker presents a starkly different picture using data.
He cites a highly specific 2021 study conducted by the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare. The data presented in the book reveals that 40% of young women and 30% of young men in Sweden report feeling lonely on a regular basis.
He uses those 40% and 30% figures as a literal sledgehammer against progressive policy. He asserts that a society where nearly half of young women are regularly isolated is not a society experiencing progress. It is a society suffering from a manufactured loneliness epidemic.
He argues that if feminist policies truly align with human nature to bring about happiness and fulfillment, the youth of the most progressive nation on earth wouldn't be suffering from such catastrophic rates of depression and isolation.
The text then contrasts this modern progressive isolation with the statistical outcomes of traditional arrangements. The author brings in a 2020 Cambridge study that examines self-reported happiness metrics across different family structures.
And according to the book, this study found that men and women report being demonstrably happier when they adhere to traditional gender roles.
Very specifically defined roles, too.
Yes, the data claims men find the highest levels of life satisfaction when acting as the primary financial breadwinners, while women report the highest levels of happiness and lowest levels of stress when focusing primarily on caregiving and homemaking.
Taking that data into account, what does the book argue this all means for the next generation? Riker posits that the collateral damage of abandoning these traditional roles is most visible in children. He highlights a 2018 study from the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry.
A critical piece of his argument.
The text states that this study proves children raised in homes with highly involved fathers who provide traditional masculine structure, boundary setting, and discipline, have measurably higher IQs, more developed social skills, and significantly fewer behavioral problems than those raised in non-traditional environments.
The author weaponizes this pediatric data to vehemently argue against the modern trend of gender-neutral parenting. The book claims that the developing brain requires distinct archetypes.
Meaning, boys need one thing, girls need another.
Exactly. Boys require strong, unapologetic male role models to teach them how to harness and direct their inherent masculine energy. And girls require strong, traditional female role models to understand feminine virtue. He frames any deviation from this dual archetype structure as a fundamental disservice, even a form of psychological abuse to children.
To cement this point, Riker zooms out from the nuclear family to a massive, global comparative analysis. The book claims that nations which stubbornly hold on to strong traditional values and rigid gender expectations, and he specifically names Japan and South Korea here, experience vastly higher degrees of social cohesion, mutual respect, and drastically lower violent crime rates.
Conversely, the text asserts that Western nations which have fully embraced radical feminism and dismantled traditional hierarchies, such as Sweden and Denmark, are actively struggling with rising rates of clinical depression, severe anxiety, and civic decay.
So he presents this macro-level geopolitical comparison as empirical, undeniable proof that traditional gender roles are not arbitrary, outdated social constructs.
Right, but rather the necessary, biologically determined blueprints for a functioning, healthy society.
This logical progression brings us to one of the most intense and complex sections of our deep dive today, the book's argument regarding institutional capture. Because if the biological data and societal outcomes are as overwhelmingly clear as Riker claims they are, how did we arrive at a cultural moment where these traditional views are not only marginalized but actively punished?
And Riker answers this by presenting a sprawling historical argument that our major sense-making institutions, education, mainstream media, and academia were systematically infiltrated and captured by feminists and cultural Marxists over the last several decades.
To explain the actual mechanics of this capture, the author introduces a very specific philosophical framework. He points heavily to the influence of the 20th century Marxist philosopher Herbert Marcuse. The book focuses intensely on Marcuse's 1965 essay outlining the concept of repressive tolerance. This is a crucial concept for you, the listener, to grasp because it forms the operating system for Riker's entire view of modern censorship.
Yes, it is the linchpin of his institutional critique.
Let's pause and unpack repressive tolerance deeply, because on its face, that phrase sounds like an oxymoron. How is Riker applying a 1960s Marxist theory to explain the behavior of modern university administrations and corporate HR departments in 2025?
Riker explains that Marcuse believed true tolerance in an unequal society only perpetuates inequality. Therefore, Marquise argued that to achieve a utopian society, institutions must practice a new kind of tolerance.
Yeah.
One that is fiercely liberating and permissive toward marginalized, progressive, or revolutionary ideas,
Okay.
while simultaneously being aggressively intolerant, repressive, and censorious toward conservative, traditional, or right-wing ideas.
Hence, repressive tolerance.
Exactly. Riker argues that this exact philosophy was quietly adopted by academics in the 60s and 70s, who then spent decades training the individuals who now run our universities, tech monopolies, and media conglomerates.
So the book is claiming this isn't just an organic cultural shift. It's the execution of a highly specific, decades-old academic playbook. Riker argues that because of this Marcusian infiltration, modern universities have been transformed into rigid intellectual monocultures. He points specifically to disciplines like gender studies, critical race theory, and queer theory.
He asserts that these are not academic disciplines in the traditional pursuit of objective truth, but rather ideological training camps that teach students to view the entire world strictly through a binary lens of oppressor and oppressed.
And the text argues that this Marxist framework creates a deeply hostile environment where professors or students who deviate even slightly from progressive orthodoxy are instantly ostracized, defunded, or fired. This, Riker claims, completely stifles any real scientific innovation, viewpoint diversity, or honest debate.
And to anchor this massive institutional claim in reality, the author provides several highly specific, concrete classroom examples.
Let's walk through the evidence he brings to the table here. First, the book cites Columbia University, claiming the institution has implemented a mandatory course titled Social Justice and Power. Riker places immense emphasis on the word mandatory.
He points out that this is not an elective for sociology majors. It is a requirement that forces every single incoming student, regardless of their field of study, to view society through a Marxist lens of power dynamics and systemic victimhood before they are allowed to graduate.
Then, the text shifts back across the Atlantic to Sweden for another cautionary tale regarding institutional overreach. The author details the policies of a state-funded preschool in Stockholm that, in 2011, implemented a complete ban on gendered language. The book states that teachers were strictly forbidden from using the words he or she and were mandated to use a newly engineered, gender-neutral pronoun, hen.
And Riker frames this Stockholm preschool not as a quirky educational experiment, but as a radical, state-sponsored psychological intervention forced upon toddlers who lack the cognitive defenses to resist it. He uses it to argue that once institutions are captured, they immediately target the most vulnerable demographic children to rewrite the foundational code of human biology.
The most prominent academic example the book utilizes is the 2017 incident at Evergreen State College involving biology professors Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying. The text details how these left-leaning evolutionary biology professors merely question the methodology of a campus equity initiative, an initiative that actively asked white students and faculty to physically leave the campus for a day.
Now, we don't need to rehash the entire biography of those professors, as the audience is likely familiar with the event, but what is vital is how Riker weaponizes this specific anecdote.
Yes, the framing.
He points out that because they dared to question this initiative using biological and egalitarian logic, they were labeled white supremacists, relentlessly harassed by mobs of students, physically threatened, and ultimately forced to resign from their tenured positions.
The author utilizes the Evergreen State incident as the ultimate proof of concept for Marcuse's repressive tolerance in action. He demonstrates that when factual biological dissent meets the intellectual monoculture of the modern university, the institution will always choose to protect the progressive ideology and eject the biological truth-teller.
Furthermore, Riker argues that this relentless institutional indoctrination takes a massive, quantifiable psychological toll on the youth passing through these systems. He claims that young women are being systematically taught that their deepest natural biological desires, such as wanting to be a devoted wife or a stay-at-home mother, are actually insidious forms of internalized oppression that they must actively fight against.
The text asserts that this framework deeply alienates young women from their own inherent femininity, causing severe cognitive dissonance. Simultaneously, the book argues young men are driven into a constant paralyzing state of guilt and confusion.
From kindergarten through college, Riker claims, boys are taught to view their inherent masculine energy, their desire to compete, to roughhouse, to conquer, as a toxic pathology that needs to be medicated or unlearned.
But if the institutions are fully captured, as Riker claims, how do they maintain such absolute control over the broader public narrative? This conceptual pivot leads us directly into the next major theme of the text, the machinery of censorship. Riker points the finger squarely at big tech monopolies and the broader apparatus of woke culture, arguing that they have colluded to create a massive, unprecedented chilling effect on free speech.
To quantify the exact scale of this chilling effect, the author brings in two specific large-scale sociological surveys. First, he cites a 2018 study conducted by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, commonly known as FIRE.
Oh, fire, right.
According to the data presented in the text, this study found that 54% of college students admit to actively self-censoring their true political and social views in the classroom to avoid offending their peers or facing disciplinary retaliation from administrators.
That statistic covers the campus environment, but he immediately pairs it with data reflecting the broader American public. The book cites a 2020 Cato Institute survey, which found that a staggering 62% of Americans are afraid to publicly share their political views for fear of professional or social ruin.
Riker uses these back-to-back statistics to construct a terrifying premise. We are no longer living in a free and open democratic society. Instead, we are living under a sophisticated form of ideological tyranny where a silenced majority is held hostage by the outrage of a hyper-vocal, institutionalized minority.
And the primary mechanism enforcing this culture of fear, according to the text, is the architecture of big tech. The author breaks down a 2021 study by the Media Research Center. The book claims this exhaustive study proves that major communication platforms, specifically Facebook, Twitter, and Google, suppress, shadow ban, or outright delete conservative and traditionalist content at a rate of 90% compared to progressive content.
90%. Riker emphasizes that this is not a margin of error. It is overwhelming systemic bias. The book argues that these digital platforms, which the public relies on as neutral town squares, are in reality highly partisan, heavily fortified ideological battlegrounds.
He claims their proprietary algorithms are specifically weaponized to artificially inflate progressive conformity while algorithmically burying any messaging that advocates for traditional family structures or biological realism.
And a critical component of his legal and cultural argument here revolves around Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. For context, the text argues that this specific 1990s legal statute acts as an impenetrable corporate shield.
Section 230.
Yes. Riker explains that Section 230 allows big tech companies to operate as aggressive publishers, actively curating, censoring, and editorializing content to fit a progressive narrative, while simultaneously enjoying the legal immunity and protections of being a neutral, hands-off utility platform. He frames this as a massive, legally sanctioned double standard that enables digital censorship on a global scale.
To vividly illustrate the real-world severity and absolute power of this censorship machinery, Riker highlights several high-profile cultural cancellations. He starts by analyzing the initial rise and subsequent targeting of clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson. He details how Peterson faced immense administrative backlash, coordinated campus protests, and vicious media smear campaigns simply for refusing to be legally compelled by Canadian law to use newly invented gender-neutral pronouns.
And Riker doesn't delve into Peterson's broader philosophy. He specifically uses this event to demonstrate how state power and institutional outrage are mobilized to crush a single individual who refuses to bend to linguistic engineering.
Right.
The book also examines the unprecedented banning of a sitting U.S. President, Donald Trump, from Twitter and other major platforms.
And again, regardless of how the reader feels about Trump politically, Riker uses this event to highlight a profound, terrifying centralization of power. He poses the question: if a small, unelected cabal of tech executives in Silicon Valley possesses the unchecked authority to completely silence the democratically elected leader of the free world, what chance does an average citizen have of protecting their right to free speech?
He extends this analysis into the entertainment industry as well, citing the highly publicized firing of actress Gina Carano from the Disney television show The Mandalorian.
The text frames Carano's sudden dismissal not as a standard corporate PR move, but as clear, undeniable evidence that expressing even mildly conservative or traditional viewpoints on personal social media accounts can literally destroy a lucrative career and instantly sever a person's livelihood. It is meant to be a warning shot to the reader.
However, the author does not end this section in despair. He points to a rapidly growing, robust counter-movement. The book issues a strong, explicit call to action for its readers to actively resist this woke cultural machinery by withdrawing their attention, their data, and their financial support from mainstream legacy platforms and migrating en masse to alternative, free speech-focused networks.
He provides a roadmap for this migration, explicitly instructing his readers to support platforms like Substack, Rumble, and Gab. He claims these platforms represent the new, untamed frontiers for free expression, specifically because their foundational architectures and leadership refuse to bow to the demands of cancel culture or advertiser boycotts.
The text also offers high praise for specific independent media entities that are successfully bypassing the legacy gatekeepers. The author highlights the massive growth of the Daily Wire, noting their strategic success in building a media empire by creating content that specifically targets red-pilled men and traditional families.
He praises their ability to package conservative ideology in content that is highly entertaining, utilizing sharp humor to effectively disarm and mock progressive talking points.
And he holds up the monumental success of Joe Rogan's podcast as the absolute pinnacle of this cultural resistance. The book emphasizes that Rogan reaches an astonishing 11 million listeners per episode, dwarfing the viewership of traditional cable news networks.
Riker praises Rogan not for being a conservative, but for platforming true, unfiltered intellectual diversity. He highlights how Rogan invites evolutionary biologists, cancel comedians, and highly controversial political figures to speak freely for hours without the artificial constraints or sanitized moderation of mainstream media.
The text argues that Rogan's unprecedented, massive success is the ultimate proof that the silent majority Riker identified in Chapter 1 is desperately hungry for unvarnished truth, authentic masculinity, and open dialogue. It proves that the demand for reality is vastly outstripping the institutional supply of progressive ideology.
Which, this realization of a hungry, mobilized populace moves us seamlessly into the final, most expansive thematic block of the book. In this concluding section, the author dramatically expands his scope. He moves from biological critiques and media analysis to the macro-level mechanics of civilizational survival, titling this concept, Religion, Geopolitics, and the Stakes of Leadership.
The text argues that the stakes of this modern cultural battle are not just about winning elections or internet arguments, they are about the literal survival of Western civilization.
He initiates this macro-analysis by examining the erosion of religious faith in the West. Riker mounts a highly robust, utilitarian defense of organized religion, specifically mentioning the historical roles of churches, mosques, and synagogues. He doesn't merely frame them as places of personal spiritual worship. He frames them as the ultimate necessary sociological bulwarks against the encroachment of gender ideology.
Through Riker's lens, religious institutions are the very last remaining structural support systems for the traditional nuclear family unit. He argues this is because major world religions fundamentally promote and mandate marriage, lifelong fidelity, and explicitly clear biologically aligned gender roles.
The author asserts that without this rigid, time-tested moral framework provided by religion, society loses its tether to objective reality and inevitably descends into tribalism, moral relativism, and ultimately demographic and cultural decay.
From the spiritual foundation, he moves directly to the geopolitical arena. And here is where Reichel makes some truly massive, sweeping historical claims. He argues that the macro-level outcomes of entire empires are directly causally tied to the biological strength or weakness of their male leadership.
A prime, detailed example presented in the text is the collapse of the Soviet Union. The author argues that the standard historical narrative that the Soviet fall was merely an economic failure caused by a flawed economic model is fundamentally incomplete. He frames the collapse fundamentally as a failure of weak, corrupt, and deeply indecisive male leadership.
Riker asserts that Soviet leaders prioritized rigid adherence to a failing progressive ideology over pragmatic, hard realities, and that this weakness at the top is what truly rotted the empire from the inside out. The book uses this as a dire historical warning. When men fail to lead with strength and pragmatism, empires inevitably crumble.
He then applies this exact same analytical lens to very recent history, specifically examining the global geopolitical response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Riker asserts that countries which possess strong, decisive, and traditionally authoritative male leaders, and he specifically points to the outcomes in South Korea and Taiwan, handled the crisis far better in terms of societal stability and economic recovery.
The text claims that, conversely, Western nations which hesitated, paralyzed by a desire for consensus, or allowed progressive ideologies regarding equity to override swift, decisive, pragmatic action, suffered far greater economic devastation and loss of public trust.
He uses the pandemic as a real-time stress test to prove his theory that traditional masculine decisiveness is a requirement for state survival in times of global crisis.
So, if the West is currently failing the stress test, where does Riker look for hope? To show what a successful modern state looks like in his view, the author points his readers toward Eastern Europe. The book reserves its highest geopolitical praise for the nation of Hungary, specifically under the leadership of Prime Minister Viktor Orban.
The author explicitly, repeatedly refers to Hungary as a beacon of sanity in a collapsing Western world.
Riker holds up Hungary because, according to the text, it is a living, breathing, legislative example of a nation that has actively legally rejected progressive, woke ideology. He praises the Hungarian government for implementing aggressive, state-funded pro-family policies, utilizing the tax code to heavily incentivize traditional marriage, and actively promoting the biological necessity of fatherhood.
And what are the tangible results of these policies that Riker points to? The book claims that because of this rigid adherence to traditional values, Hungary is successfully raising its national birth rate and maintaining cultural cohesion, while the rest of progressive Western Europe is experiencing a catastrophic demographic plummet and severe cultural fracturing.
The text uses the demographic data from Hungary as empirical, modern proof that traditional values are not just nostalgic fantasies or oppressive constructs, but practical, highly implementable policy solutions that can literally guarantee a nation's demographic survival.
Which leads directly to the author's final, overarching philosophical point, which brilliantly ties the entire book together, the concept of the inescapable hierarchy.
This is where he perfectly loops the evolutionary biology from the very first chapter into the grand geopolitics of the final chapter. Riker argues that social hierarchies are not inventions of the patriarchy. They are an absolute, inevitable mathematical reality in any human society, from ancient hunter-gatherer tribes to modern multinational corporations and global superpowers.
And crucially to his thesis, the book asserts that men naturally, inevitably sit at the top of these hierarchies. The author argues this is not due to some grand systemic conspiracy to hold women down, but simply because men are biologically predisposed by millions of years of evolution to aggressively compete for status, to systematically solve macro-level problems, and to establish physical and societal order.
The text concludes with a stark binary. When a society accepts and honors this natural biological hierarchy, it stabilizes and flourishes. When a society actively tries to dismantle it in the name of equity, chaos, loneliness, and civilizational collapse immediately ensue.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and summarize the truly incredible amount of ground we have covered today in this deep dive. We have thoroughly explored Conrad Riker's highly comprehensive, deeply provocative argument in Traditional Values Triumph. We unpacked his foundational claim that biology is destiny and gender equality is an evolutionary myth.
We examined his heavy, data-driven critique of modern feminism, his analysis of what he calls cultural Marxism, and the sophisticated woke capture of our academic and digital institutions.
And finally, we detailed his urgent geopolitical call for a masculine renaissance to save the foundations of Western civilization.
And as we close, it is vital to reiterate the strict constraint of our mission today. Our goal was to act exclusively as impartial, analytical guides through a highly polarizing text. We did not validate the author's claims, nor did we attempt to debunk them.
Right.
But by systematically unpacking his specific use of polling and sociological studies, his framing of historical events, and his intense cultural critiques, we have gained a much clearer clinical understanding of the precise arguments, the rhetorical architecture, and the deep-seated ideologies animating the manosphere and broader conservative cultural movements today.
Absolutely. Understanding the complete architecture of an argument is the required first step, regardless of where you personally stand on the political spectrum. So if you found this deep dive fascinating, if you want to look at the raw data he cites, read his intense anecdotes in full context, and examine the primary source material for yourself, head over to Amazon, Kindle, or Google Playbooks right now to buy Traditional Values Triumph.
You should also make sure to follow the author to see how his arguments are evolving in real time by checking out his Substack at the handle @Conrad Riker.
And of course, if you appreciate his taking on these heavy, complex texts and breaking them down into digestible architectural maps for you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our show right now so you never miss another deep dive.
To leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about your week, Riker argues forcefully, using a vast array of data, for a return to a single biologically grounded traditional truth in order to stabilize society.
Right.
But looking at the modern landscape, it leaves you wondering, in a deeply interconnected, highly digital world where millions of people are simultaneously building robust, isolated communities around entirely different definitions of truth and progress, is a return to a singular, unified societal structure even mechanically possible anymore? Or are we destined to permanently fragment into parallel cultures, each operating on its own set of foundational, irreconcilable realities? Something to mull over until next time.